John Carter stood in the middle of the courtroom, his back straight, his eyes resolute. But anyone could see that the suit he was wearing was worn and faded. Still, it was clean, carefully pressed, a sign of self-respect and meticulous preparation. He wasn't a lawyer. He didn't have a powerhouse legal team or stacks of case files piled high. But he had something no one else in this room did, the truth. Across the room, Ryan Lancaster sat with his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. A top-tier attorney representing the state's largest bank. He was dressed in an expensive custom-tailored suit, every stitch radiating power and prestige. His expression showed mild amusement as he studied John, as if this were nothing more than a light diversion before lunch. To him, this trial was just a formality, another routine process to crush the resistance of an ordinary citizen. Just another lone man foolish enough to challenge the system. Judge Samuel Crawley lowered his glasses and eyed John with thinly veiled condescension before speaking. Representing yourself? Well, this should be entertaining. Soft chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The people in attendance knew the law, or at least they thought they did, and they understood one thing. A man without a law degree had no chance of winning a legal battle against a corporate giant. But John Carter didn't flinch. He met the judge's gaze head-on, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here for entertainment. I'm here to win." For a moment, the courtroom fell silent. A faint chill settled over the room. No one had expected that from a regular man, someone with no money, no influence. But there was something in John's voice, an unwavering certainty, that made people pause. Did he know something they didn't? Ryan raised an eyebrow, then scoffed, as if to remind everyone that the outcome had already been decided. He had won cases like this too many times before, cases against people who believed in justice but didn't understand that justice could be bought. But John knew one thing. This wasn't just a trial. This was a battle between one man and an entire corrupt system. And if he lost today, it wasn't just him who would suffer. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of others would lose their homes, their dreams, their futures. The real question was, could one man shake the foundations of an entire system from within the walls of a courtroom? John Carter had never imagined he'd be standing here, let alone defending himself in a lawsuit that never should have happened. But it all started the day he received a thick envelope from Hudson First Bank, stamped in bold red letters. Foreclosure notice. 1425, Oak Ridge Lane wasn't just a house. It was his mother's legacy, the only thing Eleanor Carter had left behind after a lifetime of hard work. She had spent over 30 years at a textile mill, scraping together every dollar to pay off the mortgage. When she passed, John had sworn to protect that house at all costs. But now, with a single letter, everything was about to be taken away. He read the notice over and over, searching for an error. The reason for foreclosure was clearly stated: an unpaid second mortgage. That couldn't be right. His mother had never taken out another loan after nearly paying off the first one. Frantically, he dug through old documents and pulled out the attached contract. And that's when he saw it. The signature. The signature on the mortgage document wasn't his mother's. John felt his heartbeat pound in his chest. He had seen his mother sign her name thousands of times, on utility bills, insurance forms, tax documents. Her handwriting was fluid, deliberate, never rushed or shaky. But this signature, stiff, clumsy, like someone had tried to forge it. His hands clenched around the contract, knuckles turning white. What did this mean? Had someone tricked his mother? Or worse, had the bank done this on purpose? Without hesitation, he called Hudson First Bank. After several minutes on hold, a woman's voice finally came through the line. "Hudson First Bank, how can I assist you?" John took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I have questions about a second mortgage under Eleanor Carter's name. There's an issue with the paperwork." A pause. Then, when the woman spoke again, her tone was more cautious. "I'm sorry, but we can't provide any further information regarding that loan." John frowned. "What did you just say?" "This house belongs to my family. I have the right to know who signed that contract." "I apologize, sir, but all documents have been verified as legitimate. If you have any concerns, you may contact our legal department." The call ended cold and final, and in that moment, John understood. This wasn't a clerical mistake. This was fraud, and he had only just scratched the surface. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew one thing. If they thought he would sit back and let them steal his mother's house, they were wrong. Very wrong. John Carter had never felt more alone than he did at that moment. With the foreclosure notice clenched in his hand, he threw himself into the fight for justice, but every door seemed to slam shut in his face. He started by seeking out local attorneys, hoping someone would help him take on Hudson First Bank. But time and time again, he was met with the same response: rejection. Some lawyers didn't even bother looking at his case. Just hearing the name of the bank was enough for them to refuse. Others skimmed through the paperwork, then shook their heads regretfully. This is a tough one, John. You don't have solid evidence, and the bank has an army of lawyers. If they want to, they can drag this case out for years. And then, inevitably, the most important question came: how much money do you have to fight this? John let out a bitter laugh. Money? If he had money, he wouldn't be standing here begging for help. With no lawyers willing to take his case, John turned to local authorities. Surely, there had to be someone, some agency, some official, who could help expose this fraud. He spent an entire day waiting outside the office of Councilman Mark Holloway, a man with significant influence in the city. When he was finally granted a meeting, John laid everything out, his voice firm with conviction. But Holloway simply crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, his expression indifferent. Do you have any proof, Carter? John placed the fraudulent mortgage contract on the desk. This signature, it's not my mother's. You can open an investigation into this. Holloway glanced at the document, then shrugged. The bank says it's a valid signature. I have no reason to doubt them. John clenched his fists. You can help me. All you have to do is request an inquiry. Holloway sighed, as if John was wasting his time. Look, Carter, sometimes life isn't fair. If I were you, I'd find somewhere else to start over. No one beats the banks. And in that moment, John understood. Holloway wasn't just some uninformed official. He was part of the system, a system controlled by money and power, where banks could manipulate anything and anyone. John walked out of the office, his heart heavy. If lawyers wouldn't help, if the government wouldn't act, then what options did he have left? But just as he stepped outside, a voice called out from behind him. You're John Carter, aren't you? He turned. A woman stood there, her brown eyes sharp and wary. She looked intelligent, calculated, dressed in an old coat that, despite its wear, was still neatly kept. I'm Olivia Martinez, she said quietly, stepping closer. I used to work for Hudson First Bank. John frowned. Then why do you want to talk to me? She glanced around, lowering her voice. Because you're not the first. They've done this to hundreds of families. John felt his blood rush. The hopelessness that had been weighing him down was suddenly replaced by something else. Hope. And rage. Maybe he wasn't a lawyer. Maybe he was just one man, standing alone. But now he had a lead, and that was all he needed to strike back. John Carter had never imagined he'd be poring over legal textbooks, buried in laws and regulations. To him, the law had always seemed like a world reserved for the highly educated, the kind of people who wore expensive suits and spoke in polished rhetoric inside grand courtrooms. But now, with every door slammed in his face, he had no choice. He had no lawyer, no government backing, but he had one thing: the will to fight. Night after night, he sat under the glow of a desk lamp, surrounded by stacks of legal books borrowed from the local library. At first, the complex terminology overwhelmed him, but he refused to stop. He read every line, looked up every law, filled a notebook with pages of messy scribbles. And then, buried in the dry legal texts, he found something that made his heart pound. A bank cannot foreclose on a property without a valid transfer of title. John froze, reading the clause again. This was it. This was the loophole he needed. If the signature on the second mortgage was fake, then there was no valid transfer of title. And if there was no valid transfer of title, then the bank had no legal right to seize his home. He immediately got to work. Using everything he had learned, John drafted his own lawsuit against Hudson First Bank. In his filing, he didn't just accuse the bank of using a fraudulent contract. He also requested an emergency injunction to stop the foreclosure until the case was fully investigated. The day he submitted the lawsuit, the sky was gray, cold winds cutting through the city streets. As he stepped through the courthouse doors, he knew he was going up against a giant. But he also knew that if he did nothing, his mother's entire life's work would be stolen. He handed the paperwork to the court clerk, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. And then, something unexpected happened. Judge Samuel Crawley accepted his case. No one in the city believed that an ordinary man, with no legal background, could convince a judge to hear him out, even on a temporary basis. But Crawley, despite his arrogance and cold demeanor, couldn't ignore a clear legal argument. Not only that, but he issued a ruling. Hudson First Bank was ordered to turn over all documents related to the second mortgage. John stepped out of the courthouse and took a deep breath. This was just a small victory, a single door cracked open. He knew the bank wouldn't take this lying down. They would fight back. Hard. Maybe even resort to dirty tactics. But for the first time since this battle began, he didn't feel alone anymore. Because now, he had a real chance to fight back. John Carter thought that Judge Crawley accepting his lawsuit was a turning point, but he had no idea it was only the beginning of a real nightmare. Hudson First Bank wasn't just a financial institution. It was a monster capable of crushing anyone who dared to challenge its power. And John, a lone man, had just provoked it. Just 3 days after the court ordered the bank to produce mortgage documents, John discovered that his bank account had been frozen. He wasn't wealthy, but the little money he had was all that kept him afloat. Now, he couldn't withdraw cash, couldn't pay his utility bills, couldn't even afford a decent meal. He called the bank for an explanation, only to be met with a cold, robotic voice from the customer service line. "Sir, your account has been frozen due to suspected fraudulent activity. We cannot provide further details at this time." Fraud? Are they serious? John realized this wasn't a coincidence. This was a warning. But they weren't done yet. The next morning, as he stepped outside to head to work, his car was gone. A repossession agent stood there with a smug smirk, holding out a clipboard. "Mr. Carter, your vehicle has been repossessed due to an outstanding loan." John felt his blood boil. What loan? He had never taken out a car loan. But when he checked, his name was tied to a fraudulent debt, just like the forged mortgage on his mother's house. Now, without a car, he couldn't get to work. And he knew exactly what was coming next. That afternoon, his boss called. His voice was heavy with hesitation. "John, I'm really sorry, but we can't keep you on any longer. There's too much pressure from our investors." John let out a bitter laugh. He knew who was behind this. The company's biggest financial backers were tied to Hudson First Bank. One phone call was all it took to destroy his career. But the final blow was the cruelest. That evening, when he returned home, he found his front door locked. The locks had been changed. He pounded on the door, called the building manager. No one answered. Frustrated, he climbed over the backyard fence, searching for another way inside. But just as he slipped in through the back, the sharp sound of police sirens filled the air. Within minutes, 2 officers burst in, flashlights blinding him. "And where we can see them." John froze. "This is my house. What the hell is going on?" One of the officers cuffed him without hesitation. "Mr. Carter, you're under arrest for trespassing." John stood there in the dark, the cold steel of the handcuffs pressing against his wrists. They didn't just want his home. They wanted to break him. John Carter sat in a small rental apartment, staring at the computer screen. The internal emails Olivia Martinez had just given him sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just a single case. This was a system, a calculated, organized scheme designed to steal homes from innocent people. The first email was from a senior bank executive. The subject line was chilling in its bluntness. "Accelerate foreclosure process." Inside, the message was even colder. "Objective: process overdue loans as quickly as possible. If necessary, adjust documentation to avoid delays. Do not allow customers the opportunity to appeal." John clenched his fists. Adjust documentation, a sanitized way of saying they were falsifying legal records. His mother had just been one of hundreds of victims. He gritted his teeth. They thought they could manipulate the law. They thought they could trample over ordinary people, and no one would fight back. But now John had proof. Olivia placed a hand on his shoulder. We're not done yet, John. If you want to take them down, you need one more thing. A witness willing to tell the truth. A notary's confession. John knew that to expose the fraud, he had to find the person who had certified the forged mortgage. That person was Denise Fowler, the notary hired by the bank to validate the documents. If she had knowingly stamped a fake signature, she was a key link in the case. He found her office in a quiet part of town, a small, unassuming space tucked away from busy streets. As soon as John stepped inside, she tensed. Her brown eyes, framed by round glasses, flickered with unease. "I can't help you," she said immediately, the moment he mentioned Hudson First Bank. John wasn't surprised. He pulled a printed copy of one of the internal emails Olivia had given him and placed it on her desk. "I'm not here to threaten you, Denise. I'm here to give you a chance." He paused, locking eyes with her. "You know what they've done, and I know you were involved, whether voluntarily or because they force you." Denise stared at the document. Her face went pale. She knew that if this email was real, Hudson First Bank wasn't just facing a civil lawsuit. They could be facing criminal charges. Her hands trembled as she removed her glasses. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I never saw your mother sign that contract." John's pulse pounded. She took a shaky breath and continued. "They gave me a stack of papers already filled out. A bank executive told me to stamp them. I did what I was told. I didn't ask questions." John felt his heart slam against his ribs. This was it. This was the testimony he needed. He leaned forward, his voice steady. "Are you willing to testify?" Denise hesitated, fear flashing across her face. She knew what it meant, going up against a corporation that had destroyed people's lives without a second thought. But then, she let out a deep breath, as if releasing a weight she had carried for too long. "I'll do the right thing." John clenched his fists. Now, he had everything he needed. A paper trail of undeniable fraud. A witness ready to expose the truth. And most importantly, a reason to keep fighting. John Carter thought he was fighting a corrupt bank. But as the pieces started coming together, he realized the truth was far worse. This wasn't just a case of fraud. It was an entire system built to exploit the powerless. Olivia Martinez sat across from him in her small apartment, her expression grave. She opened her laptop, scrolling through the documents she had secretly collected during her years at Hudson First Bank. Internal emails, suspicious financial reports, altered paperwork used to justify foreclosures. She pointed to a long list of properties the bank had seized over the past 5 years. "They've done this to hundreds of families, John, and they weren't working alone. The web of corruption, banks, politics, judiciary. Hudson First Bank didn't just forge mortgage contracts. They created fake loans to trap customers, then fast-tracked the foreclosure process to steal their homes. Local politicians, including Councilman Mark Holloway, have been paid off to look the other way. Holloway didn't just ignore complaints like John's. He actively pushed for laws that made it easier for banks to evict people. Even the judicial system was compromised. Some judges have been bought to fast-track foreclosures, rubber-stamp fraudulent rulings, and make sure no one ever won a case against the bank." A cold wave washed over John. He remembered how Judge Samuel Crawley had smirked at him in court. "Representing yourself? This should be entertaining." Now, John couldn't help but wonder, was Crawley part of this, too? Leaning back in his chair, his mind reeled. He wasn't just up against a bank. He was up against an entire system designed to crush people like him. He looked at Olivia, his voice steady. "So how do you take down a monster like this?" Olivia took a deep breath. "We expose it. All of it." For the first time since this fight began, John wasn't afraid anymore. Because now, he knew exactly who his real enemies were. The first attempt on his life. John knew he was pissing off powerful people. But he never thought they'd come after him like this. He was crossing the street after leaving a cafe where he and Olivia had secretly planned their next move. It was a quiet road, barely any traffic. Then he heard the roar of an engine. He turned his head. A black SUV was racing straight toward him. He had 1 second to react. His body moved on instinct, diving to the side, just as the vehicle narrowly missed him and slammed into a street pole before speeding away. No license plate, no trace left behind. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't an accident. They were trying to kill him. John stumbled into Olivia's apartment, his clothes dirty, his face pale with shock. When she opened the door and saw him, she immediately pulled him inside and locked it. "What happened?" she asked, eyes filled with concern. John took a shaky breath and told her everything. Olivia clenched her fists, her face darkening. "I warned you, John." Her voice was low. "They played dirty. And if you're not careful, you could be next." For the first time, John saw real fear in her eyes. And he realized it wasn't just him in danger. Anyone who stood against this system could be erased. The break-in. Just hours later, it got worse. John and Olivia returned to her apartment, only to find the door slightly open. They froze, then stepped inside. The place had been trashed, drawers pulled out, papers scattered across the floor. Her laptop smashed. Olivia rushed to her desk, searching for a hidden file of critical evidence she had stashed away. Gone. They took everything. Her voice was barely a whisper, her hands trembling. All of it, the internal emails, the victim list, the bribes connected to Holloway, it's all gone. John felt a surge of rage. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. They were erasing the truth. Olivia turned to him, eyes filled with urgency. "We're running out of time, John." The final warning. Before John could figure out their next move, his phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A deep, gravelly voice came through the line. "You still have time to walk away." Silence. Then, "If you don't, you're going to regret it." The line went dead. John stared at his phone, his grip tightening. This wasn't a legal battle anymore. This was war. The showdown in court, the final battle. John Carter stepped into the courtroom with an air of confidence that no one could ignore. He was no longer the man in a worn-out suit, trembling before a judge. Today, he was here to fight. Across the room, Ryan Lancaster, the senior attorney representing Hudson First Bank, sat with his legs crossed, his eyes filled with arrogance. He had won hundreds of cases like this. To him, John was just another desperate man who had gotten lucky. But luck couldn't beat the law, especially when the law had already been bought. At the center of the courtroom, Judge Samuel Crawley tapped his gavel lightly. He eyed John with the same skepticism as before. He probably still thought this lawsuit was a waste of time. But today, John had something they weren't expecting. The game-changing evidence, the internal video. John took a deep breath and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to present new evidence." Lancaster chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Another piece of evidence, Carter? I think we've had enough entertainment for today." John ignored him and nodded to Olivia, who inserted a USB drive into the courtroom's computer. A video appeared on the large screen. The footage flickered for a moment before clearing up. An internal meeting at Hudson First Bank. A man in an expensive suit, a high-ranking bank executive, was speaking to a group of legal staff. His voice was casual, as if he were discussing a simple procedural task. "All we have to do is stall long enough. By the time they realize the signatures are fake, it'll already be too late." The courtroom fell silent. John turned to Lancaster. The smirk on his face was gone. Judge Crawley leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. For the first time since the trial began, he looked troubled. Ryan Lancaster's desperate counterattack, but it's too late. Lancaster shot to his feet, his voice hurried. "Objection. This video is inadmissible. It doesn't prove any direct fraud." John cut him off. "This isn't the only evidence, Your Honor." He raised a thick stack of documents. "I have a sworn statement from a notary confirming the forged signature on my mother's mortgage. I have internal bank emails proving they intentionally falsified records. And now, we have this video. A direct confession from a Hudson First Bank executive." He turned back to Lancaster, his voice steady and sharp. "If this isn't fraud, then what is?" Lancaster's mouth opened, but no words came out. He glanced at Judge Crawley, desperate for an intervention. But the judge remained silent, deep in thought. John knew the battle was nearly over. Judge Crawley's ruling. Crawley banged his gavel. His voice no longer carried the same condescension as before. "Based on the evidence presented, I rule that." John held his breath. "The foreclosure on the plaintiff's home is to be immediately halted." A murmur spread through the courtroom. But Crawley wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering a formal investigation into Hudson First Bank's foreclosure practices and potential fraud in prior cases. John had won. The bank collapses, the system shakes. John Carter was no longer just a man fighting to save his mother's home. He had become a symbol of justice. Within 24 hours of the ruling, the scandal exploded across national media. The truth comes to light. News outlets ran headline after headline exposing the fraud. Massive bank fraud scandal uncovered. Hudson First Bank under investigation. Hundreds of families illegally evicted. 8 decades of corruption exposed. From a small courtroom to national headlines. How one man took on the system and won. CNN, NBC, and the New York Times covered the case in full detail. This is one of the biggest financial scandals of the decade, a Washington Post editor remarked. Hudson First Bank stole homes from innocent families. But now they won't get away with it. John saw his face on the news, but he knew this wasn't just his victory. This was a victory for everyone who had ever been crushed by the system. Hudson First Bank crumbles. As soon as the court ordered an official investigation, Hudson First Bank's stock plummeted. Investors scrambled to pull out. Customers rushed to close their accounts. Those who once protected the bank's fraud now abandoned it. Within a week, Richard Gaines, the CEO, resigned. "I deeply regret the misconduct that has taken place within our institution," he told reporters. But no one believed his apology. Then the FBI got involved. Top executives were subpoenaed, their secret transactions uncovered. Evidence showed millions of dollars have been funneled into hidden accounts to cover up the fraud. The downfall of the villains. But it wasn't just the bank that fell. The people behind it fell too. Ryan Lancaster, the arrogant lawyer, had his license revoked after the Bar Association uncovered his role in forging legal documents. Councilman Mark Holloway, who ignored John's pleas, was indicted for bribery. Bank records and leaked emails proved he had taken hundreds of thousands of dollars to pass laws that made it easier for banks to steal homes. When police escorted Holloway out of his office in handcuffs, John knew the fight was truly over. The corrupt system he once thought was invincible had crumbled before his eyes. A new beginning. Months later, John returned home. The house his mother had fought to keep was still standing. But now, it was more than just a house. It was a symbol of resilience, justice, and proof that even one person could bring down a system designed to crush them. Olivia stood beside him, smiling. "You did it, John." He nodded, taking a deep breath. He hadn't just saved his home. He had proven that no matter how powerful corruption seemed, the truth could still win. And this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The bribe. John refuses to be silenced. The room was eerily silent as John Carter stared at the contract in front of him. Across the table, a representative from Hudson First Bank, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, sat with his hands clasped together, waiting. There was no arrogance in his posture, no smug smirk like Ryan Lancaster had once worn in court. This man wasn't here to mock him. He was here to beg, a cornered animal, desperate for an escape. John's eyes drifted to the six-figure number printed on the document. It was enough to pay off every debt he had, enough to buy a new home, enough to start over without worry. All he had to do was one thing: stay silent. The contract was clear. By signing this agreement, Mr. John Carter agrees to forfeit all legal claims against Hudson First Bank and commits to non-disclosure of any details regarding the lawsuit or individuals involved. And, most importantly, signing here will ensure the termination of all ongoing investigations. John took a deep breath, his fingers grazing the edge of the paper. Did they really think he would sign? After everything they had done? After what they had done to his mother, to the families forced into the streets on cold, rainy nights? He lifted his head, locking eyes with the bank's representative. No, a single word. The man's face tightened. "Mr. Carter, I suggest you think this through. This is your last chance to walk away." John let out a quiet laugh and pushed the contract back across the table. "No, you're the ones who need a way out." The man clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. But he knew the battle was already lost. John stood up without another word, heading for the door. As he stepped outside, Olivia Martinez was waiting, arms crossed, leaning against the wall. "How much did they offer?" she asked. "Enough for me to never worry about money again," John replied casually. Olivia tilted her head, studying his face. "And you turn it down?" John shrugged, as if the decision had never been in question. "I didn't fight for the money. I fought for justice." She held his gaze for a long moment, then smiled, a proud, knowing smile. "You didn't just save your own home, John," she said. "You just saved hundreds of families." John glanced up at the clear blue sky above. For the first time in years, he felt light. They tried to buy his silence. But John Carter knew one truth: justice has no price. The legacy: John becomes a symbol. John Carter stood on the front porch of 1425 Oak Ridge Lane, the place where it all began. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak trees that lined the street where he had grown up. Today, he wasn't a desperate man fighting against an unstoppable force. Today, he was the man who won. The house is finally home again. After everything, the lawsuits, the sleepless nights, the near-death experiences. The house his mother had spent her entire life protecting was legally his again. But this victory wasn't just for him. The story of his case spread like wildfire. Families who had lost their homes to the same fraudulent schemes began coming forward, demanding justice. More lawsuits were filed. More banks were exposed. More corrupt politicians and judges were dragged into the light. The system that once seemed invincible was now crumbling. A new mission is born. But for John, the fight wasn't over. He refused to let this happen to anyone else. With Olivia Martinez by his side, he launched a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting victims of bank fraud. They provided free legal assistance, helped families reclaim their homes, and made sure no one had to fight alone like John once did. Within a year, his organization had saved dozens of families from wrongful foreclosures. Victims became warriors in the fight against corruption. One evening, as John was leaving his office, an elderly woman approached him. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Because of you, my family still has a home." John smiled and gently squeezed her hand. "I just did the right thing, ma'am." But she shook her head. "No, son, you did so much more. You gave us hope. They wanted me to give up, but I won." That night, as John stood on his front porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, he reflected on everything that had happened. They wanted me to give up. They tried to crush me, but he had stood his ground, and he won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been trampled by this system. John Carter, the man who once had nothing, was now a symbol of justice.